Cheryl, welcome to the show. I'm really excited about what you have to say about different generations at work. So why don't you introduce yourself to the audience?
Thanks so much, David. I'm Cheryl Fields Tyler. Blue Beyond Consulting is my company. I started it 18 years ago. We're experts on the people side of business. And a part of this work, we've done two now national studies around what's happening with workers in the workforce, particularly knowledge workers, people leaders, HR, and senior leaders, trying to understand kind of the nuances and understanding between those different roles. And we've looked pretty extensively at the different generational cohorts as well, and have some really interesting data that we can share today, as well as talk a little bit about what it means for leaders to be leading folks across generations.
Okay, well, that sounds great. I don't know where to start. I have looked at different generations. Obviously, I'm way up in the boomer generation, and but I have concerns over Gen Z and the generation coming up, and whether it's work ethic or just understanding how to do good work. And so, where would you like to dive in?
Yeah, well, why don't we start just by doing some initial kind of baseline setting? I mean, one is that in our recent survey, one of the things that we found really revelatory, David, is that there's so much more in common than difference between the generations in terms of what they're looking for from the workplace. They're looking for things like employee well-being to be, for instance, in 2021, we saw that employee well-being desire really high for millennials and Gen Z, less so for Gen X and boomers. In this survey in 24, everybody's at the same level. That's the number one priority across the generations is employee well-being. I think another one that people are really interested to hear about is that something like leadership effectiveness, people capability, manager capabilities, and learning and career development. You'd think that some of those things would be a little more, kind of weighted toward generations who are still eager to get their career going, et cetera. Actually, highly prioritized across all generations, and more so now than it was 3 years ago in 2021 when we did the baseline for this data. Another key piece, employee flexibility and where they work. That's one of the subtle differences. I would say that the under 45 set, millennials and Gen Z, are really very committed to this new way of working, this kind of hybrid and remote and the different kinds of ways of working, and really see workplace flexibility in how they work and where they work as being core to how they want to sort of grow their careers in the future. But it's also pretty important to boomers and Gen X. So it's very interesting to see how, in many ways, the generations are converging, not diverging, in the modern workplace.
So with the flexible workspace or them not being in the office 100% of the time, is this something, are you seeing something with a generation, any of the generations or multiple, that they really, which one do they prefer? In office or hybrid or totally remote? Is it just totally remote? Or is which one of those three areas is number one?
Hybrid is definitely number one in our data as well as in other data that we're seeing. Interestingly, this hasn't to do with the generations per se, but across all of the roles that we surveyed, knowledge workers, so frontline knowledge workers, people managers, HR leaders, and senior leaders, CEOs and other C-suite leaders. Now, across all of them, around 50% are not in the office full time. Think about that for a
Yeah.
second. What a sea change that has been, right, since the last few years. And actually, in generational terms, the younger workers, the Gen Zers, so to speak, they are actually really eager to be in the office, but they want it to be purposeful. They want it to be meaningful. They don't want it to be obligatory. They'd like to have more self determination, more voice, and feel more trusted to be able to work outside of the office in productive ways. That's what our data is showing us. But again, across all generations, there's a high premium on flexibility. I think most people would say that flexibility includes being in the office some of the time, but it's really around that trust me, help me have some control over my life. And I think it's very close to this employee well-being theme that we see as such a high priority across generations. Is people see that a hybrid work style and flexibility and agility and some self-determination is actually just better for their health, mental health, physical health, and overall well-being in their lives.
And do you have any data or conclusions on they want to be in the office at least part of the time? What are the specifics of what they want to get out of that time?
They want to build relationships that will carry over to when we're working in the way that you and I are talking today. They want to have meaningful collaboration where we can be doing problem solving, creativity, innovation together. They want to be able to get to know the leaders in their organization in such a way that they feel like that they have some sense of more tangible trust in those people. And I think the last thing I would say is we talk about lore creating experiences in our business. Others use this term moments that matter, or this phrase moments that matter. For high stakes conversations, for shared experiences that are going to create sort of culture building, sort of well beyond those experiences. Those are the kinds that they feel like, oh yeah, that's worth getting in my car commuting. That's worth getting on an airplane if I have to fly. That's worth being in there day after day. But if it's really just to come in and do my Zoom meetings at a cubicle that I'm hoteling at 3 days a week, not so much.
Yeah, yeah. So in your report, as I recall, was called "Good for Me, Good for Us, Good for the World," and
That was the one in 2021. Yes, that's the
that's
report
the
that we
one
did in 21.
2021. Okay, okay. So I
Yes,
saw
this
that
new
one.
Yes, the new report is called "Winning on the People Side of Business," and it essentially takes the data that we did redid the survey, but added some new pieces around hybrid work, around AI, and some other aspects of that are more germane to today's workplace.
Okay, well, it's really interesting for me that meaningful work is a big one for everyone. That's
Yes.
when I designed our my three strands leadership process. There was systematic power, that's the foundation, your systems, and then the heart and the energy came from meaningful work, center strand. And I'm curious, what types, how do they want to do that meaningful work? Why, in what ways is it meaningful to them? Do you have any stories from the
Um,
data that you got or the surveys you did? Did people share things or was it more just statistical?
this survey was more statistical, but we did do a lot of key informant interviews with leaders and with others. We're actually in a second phase. We're going to do some focus groups and that kind of thing with folks. But this is also the kind of thing that we do a lot of focus groups and qualitative interviews and work within our clients. So I can certainly share a couple of stories. When people talk about meaningful work, I think the first thing they think about is work that feels like it's adding value to my life. That I feel like my work is not detracting from my life, but it's a net positive in my life. The relationships are relatively healthy, good enough. Maybe not the my, one of the Gallup questions is, I have a best friend at work. I don't know that everybody expects to have a best friend at work, but they want that friendship equity, in their workplace. A second part is that they feel a basic, an essential sense of fairness. This goes to things like pay equity and things like that, particularly between male and female, as well as other dimensions of diversity. It goes to, kind of, do I feel like I'm treated fairly in the workplace? A third dimension that I think is really important, was very important in our survey 3 years ago. It's still important, particularly for the younger generations, is around values alignment. So, 3 years ago when we did our survey in 21, I probably don't have to remind you and don't have to remind our listeners, we were at a particularly fraught moment in our society at that moment around Black Lives Matter. We did our survey just weeks after January 6th. We're dealing with all the kinds of polarization, and people were really, and of course, the pandemic. And at that time, people really said, I want to work for an employer that, and I think at that moment that was so heightened because of all of those societal issues. Interestingly, we've seen somewhat of an erosion in this sense of like my values have to be explicit in my organization where I work, but they still say I want values to be explicit. In other words, I want to know that I'm going to be in an organization that's ethical, that is doing the right thing by people and for people in the society at large. So that whole thing around, we were at a moment, I think 3 years ago, where people were looking for their businesses to take a stand. I think that stuff is a little bit more in the back backdrop right now, honestly, David. But I think what has continued to be just as strong is I want to work for an organization that is doing good in the world in some fashion.
Cheryl, I'm all bought into that, but I'm also, I feel like I need to play a little bit of the skeptic in here too, is that there's still so much going on, particularly in America, but I think worldwide, where the
Yes.
rich are getting richer and the politicians are taking, um, they are exercising powers that, aren't in the Constitution. And there's more of this, the powerful are getting more powerful, the rich are getting richer. We now see pension funds and investment groups, buying an entire housing tract of 200 or 300 homes and making people renters instead of they have an opportunity to buy a single family home. So a lot of these jobs that are out there for larger companies, how do they find meaning in that? How do they, so what percentage is really driven by meaning? Whereas we have this other percentage of people who are still driven by greed and power.
Yeah, this is firmly moving into the part of, I mean, this is me just really observing and, I don't have data around this data. David, I want to acknowledge that two or three things I've learned over the course of my career is that, I remember early on, I was working for an organization that happened to be a big European company that was building a lab in Silicon Valley. And they were really, they were an amazing company, did all of the European style supports for employees and that kind of thing. They were having a heck of a time getting people to come to work there. And they hired us to try to figure out like why don't people want to work for us? Why don't people want to work for us? And the reality was is that the people that they wanted were people that wanted to be in small startups, wearing their flip-flops to work. That was even then, I'm talking now 15, 20 years ago, and
Yeah.
who were not interested in that kind of safety net type of environment, that more paternalistic type of environment. This was Silicon Valley, 15, 20 years ago. On the other hand, if they were willing to compromise a little bit, be a little soften some of their policies, make it a little bit more open, that kind of thing. We found as we did some kind of talent sort of assessments and looked into their organization, did some focus groups, there was a segment of the workforce that really wanted to be in that kind of soft and supportive environment. At least that was the language that they were using. And so it was less about try to attract all of the people and more about what's the overlap between that set of capabilities that you need for your lab in terms of technical capabilities and people that share this set of values. And so that overlap between values and capability is often what I think it comes down to. And candidly, it would not be my value set to be working in an organization that is really sort of thinking about how to buy up houses and then kind of rent them back to people. That's not my value set. But, it's one of the downsides, and some would say the upsides of living in a capitalist society is that there are people for whom that's a really meaningful set of values. And I'm not justifying it or not. I'm just saying that is part of our society and part of our capitalist system. So I think that it's really about finding that overlap between my values and the organization that I work in. Some of the things that came up across our survey as values that people care about across many, many different types of company sizes, geographies are around, operating ethically, giving back to my community, operating in a way that's environmentally, ethically sound as well. So there are some things that we hold in great polarization.
Is it, how many companies were in your survey?
It was actually individual. So it was 1,222 or something like
Yeah, I
that.
thought
But
it was like 1,200. Yeah, okay. So it's
statistically,
1,222. And were they all
mhm.
in different companies or each individual, or were some of
Yes.
them in the same? Okay. And
Yeah,
how were they
statistically,
chosen?
we used a third party research firm that really does this for a living, and does a very, very, very thorough job. So it's statistically, valid data to probably 2 or 3 percentage points. Even if we had done 10 times, 100 times, 1,000 times more individuals.
It's interesting. I mean, and once again, don't take offense at what I'm saying. I'm just actually sincerely involved in the conversation. But um, what's the potential that they didn't choose companies that might have not strong values or values that were not, I don't want to use too strong of a word, whether it's ethical or meaningful or so what's the potential that you hit certain types of company, which is great. And you found a broad range, different industries, but you kind of hit the ones somehow, not intentionally, that had good intentions and had some good morals and ethics and they really cared about their people. And some of the other ones that care less didn't make it in, or those people weren't interviewed. Is that possible?
I mean, it's not possible from the point of view of our survey vendor. I mean, that's not how, there was no testing that was done to select people in and out of the survey. You know, it's one of the challenges, of course, with any data set, David, is there's always going to be that question of like, well, wait a minute, is that but I will say, I was just reading the American Psychological Association, APA, I believe, in the last couple of weeks, released their Americans at Work survey, and very consistent with our own. So I don't think what we're seeing is really that outlandish. Edelman's Trust Barometer, they do a very broad survey and have done it for years. Their survey is also very broadly aligned with our own. So are there specific places where we could say, oh, that doesn't quite work? Of course, but that the data doesn't say unanimity, right? We're talking about percentages and that kind of thing. So, but I hear what you're saying. I mean, and it certainly is true that we have seen an erosion in the number of people saying working for a company that reflects my values is highly important to me. That was very important in 2021 to a higher number of people than it is now, but it's still important to the majority of people now. So that doesn't mean that it's not important. It just means that there's been an erosion over the last 3 years.
Yeah, and it's also interesting the things that I've seen, and you've probably seen more because you probably track this more, but we're still seeing a lot of startups happening, a lot of people that want to go out and improve the world. I could say change the world, but I think they're seeking to improve it. And so that they then seek people that are like-minded to go and do that. And what about the issue? Did your survey uncover it all as far as it really seems that there is a lack of parental, and I haven't been the perfect parent, so please don't take me as Mr. Judge of other parents. No one would rate me perfect. I love my kids, but parental guidance and also in the workplace, real, not just training, but mentoring on work ethic and how to do excellent work and really coming along. I would think your survey reinforces that people are looking for that. That's what I'm hearing you say. But I'm sensing that there is a gap with a lot of companies on how well they're doing this and giving, people want that meaningful piece. But part of the meaning, and I'd like to get back to that, but part of the meaning is simply developing me. And they're thinking, I want to go learn these tech widgets, AI, whatever it is. But a lot of what they need is how do I manage my time? How to get along with others, how to avoid or resolve confrontation, how to set goals and achieve them, blah, blah, blah. Did any of the data or conversations that you've had with people come back with some feedback in that area? Or is the people development piece and how well it's being done?
Certainly, it's a very high priority across all of our respondents in our survey, learning and career development. I think there's two dimensions that we can see in our data. One is that people are seeing this need for just a growth mindset, constant learning to be just a part of their jobs, their lives, and companies are prioritizing that at a very high level. And I think, the dawn of AI, the challenges in kind of global markets, just the continued, I don't know if you're familiar with the VUCA world, volatile, uncertain, complex, ambiguous, I think is what those stand for, but don't quote me on that. I guess I'm on the record now, but they stand for words similar to that, originally coined by the War College back, I think, in the 80s, and it's just gotten more and more true. The world is really VUCA on steroids now, but that kind of world is really requires us to operate from a place of curiosity, of empathy, of learning, and of constant learning in order to be able to manage through it and to really manage the anxiety and challenges of being in that kind of world. So I think that's one piece. I think a second piece that we didn't see in the data per se, but is something we heard more through the key informant interviews, is that everybody's realizing that the pandemic, particularly for younger workers, a lot of these younger workers were, not able to be in college in person. They didn't get to do internships in person. So there is some things that we need to do to have a really concerted effort to support people and just, kind of that onboarding experience that, it's just about making the implicit explicit for people so that people have every chance to be successful. I wouldn't want to say that I think people are by nature or by generationally, kind of constitutionally different than I was when I was 21 years old and going to my first job. In fact, I can remember in one of my early roles being asked, like, why aren't you filling out your timesheet in a more routine way? And it was like, I thought I was. I thought everybody did it, once a week on Fridays. And lo and behold, no, I was supposed to be doing it every day before I left. Nobody told me that. They just assumed that I knew. So I think that there's things that we sometimes assume that people know that we don't make explicit. And I think we need to make those things explicit.
And I think that's brilliant of you to bring that up. And it makes me wonder, was any part of your work with leaders asking them, hey, here's what the survey is saying people want. Talk to me about how you're meeting these requirements or meeting these desires, wants.
Yeah, in many ways, we do a ton of that kind of work, of course, in our consulting business, David. We work with organizations around their people side of business issues. It's usually not a generic question, it's a more specific one. We're a company that has great technology and, we're trying to scale, or we're a company that has been at the top of our game and now we have more competitors. Now we need to get more innovation. We're an organization that has great leadership, but we don't know how to. So we work on all those kinds of issues with organizations. And, I think for me, this data just supports, supports three things. One is that business leaders are clearly prioritizing the people side of business. We certainly see it in our work, but we really see it in this data. From 21 to now, I think it was something like 18 points jump in things like culture, people management, things like that from 21 till now, in terms of what senior leaders are saying it's going to take for their organizations to thrive now and into the future. And that was not just the people set of issues we were asking about. We were asking about innovation, supply chain, other kinds of like the so-called hard business issues, so to speak. And I think it's just another example of that old adage, the soft stuff is the hard stuff in business. And it's only getting harder as all of the different ways of working are changing. And I think as we are realizing that really the only sustainable competitive advantage in organizations is people. It's getting the talent and getting the talent working together in a way that really unleashes the potential of the organization. And so we're seeing that in the data. I think a second thing that we're seeing in the data is just an incredible need for more and more effective communication. We are in a cacophony of messages all the time in our lives, but that happens at work too, and I really think that the best and most important job of a leader in organizations now is to amplify the signal and diminish the noise. Help people understand what is really truly important around here. How can you be successful? How can you contribute? How can you make a difference for clients or for customers? And to keep that repetition and that support of communication ongoing. And then the third one is what we've already talked about, which is really around, that constant learning, really creating what they call it, Microsoft, the learn it all organization versus the know it all organization, really cultivating a growth mindset at scale so that people in the organization really get rewarded, not just for showing what they know, but showing how they learn. And that really is the kind of sort of investment you can make in people that pays dividends forever. Because once people become growth mindset dominant learners, there's just very little that they can't master.
And how well do you think companies are doing at going beyond just the teaching and hopefully some and mentoring, but actually then testing and rewarding people or recognizing people based on how well they apply what they learn on an ongoing basis?
That's a great question. I think that organizations are constantly struggling with performance management. How do we actually support uh, our people managers on the front line in differentiating performance, being able to give good feedback, give good coaching, and kind of know the difference between average and exceptional. So I think that's an ongoing thing. One of the things that I really feel, and this is kind of me, point of view from of one, David, but I think we know so much now that we didn't know 10 years ago, 20 years ago on how to unleash human potential, especially individually and in teams. But yet we are not doing a good enough job in business or in any other sector of society actually at really cultivating people leaders that are, kind of like masters, like ninja masters at creating the conditions for people to be exceptional. We still think about leadership and manager as sort of a set of qualities, first and foremost, that people possess. And then the fact that they were good at their job probably makes them an effective leader or manager of people. See, I really think we need to create leadership and management as like a practice in the same way that physicians have a practice or, therapists have a practice or yoga is a practice, meditation is a practice. People leadership, people management should be a practice. It's something that we can get better at over time with practice. There are certain things that work really effectively for people that we need to learn and hone and get those skills over time. So I think this whole point of like, how do we differentiate between performers? It really starts with leadership and managers knowing how to do that. And I don't think we've actually developed those skills as effectively as we need to.
Well, I can really relate to that because back in 2003, I came to the realization that I had leadership attributes, but no skills. So I was, you think of professional sports. There's some people who are great professional athletes, but they're never going to be a good coach. Somebody
Mhm.
like Steve Kerr of the Golden State Warriors, who, you know,
My all-time fave.
yeah,
I'm in
yeah.
California.
Oh, yeah.
Warriors
I am,
fan to the core.
I am too. I'm a Warriors fan too. So, yeah, we're preaching to the choir. But Kerr's been brilliant with the Warriors on how he can bring them together, and it's very rare. There's been some other ones. Larry Bird with the Celtics has it been very effective, done a great job. It takes a certain type of person. I think one of the things I work with a lot of leaders, and I do management consulting, and I have a very strong system for hiring. And I find that one of the biggest struggles they have, you've alluded to, and that is, all this noise. All the noise has to do with tasks and stuff. And so they haven't been trained, like you say. So it's a superpower, or they realize, oh, my number one priority is people and developing my people, bonding my people, and helping them do meaningful work and feel valued for it. And so they get caught up in the stuff and the people development, the regular meetings, the follow up, the follow through doesn't happen. And so their people don't feel valued. They don't feel as engaged. They don't feel like they can't get focused because their leader is still fighting fires. So, have you seen any type of indications of that in the conversations you've had with different leaders?
Yeah, I think that uh, well, it was in Good to Great, right? He talked about the level 5 leader.
Hmm. Yeah.
I mean, that typology has been around for a long time in terms of essentially leadership that really gets to the core that their success is through others. They only succeed through others. And at scale, through an organization working together in a way that manifests greatness, not because I'm in the room every day, but because the culture and processes and practices of the organization actually enable the people to be great, right?
Yeah.
That image of leadership has been around for a very long time, probably for millennia, actually. But it's kind of to what I was saying before, and I'm sure your work has been this way too, David, is that for whatever reason, we know a lot about what it takes to be that kind of leader. We know a lot about what it takes to um, create the skill that kind of leader possesses, the mindsets that we don't really work to develop those kinds of leaders. We think they're accidental. We think they just emerge from sort of the zeitgeist, when actually we can develop those kinds of leaders. It does mean at times that you have to de-emphasize the person who can get stuff done effectively through brute force and intimidation in order to actually elevate the people that can get things done at scale through people more effectively. I'm not saying that that's soft. I actually think I think of effective leadership is really grounded in building organizations of deep trust and high expectations. When deep trust and high expectations are both present and then they start to work together, that's when you unleash human potential. I think a lot of organizations, we do a lot of cultural assessments, and they think that the high expectations, by sort of walking around yelling, demanding, putting impossible goals in front of people, that that's the way you get high expectations. High expectations is really about a growth mindset and creating the conditions for people to strive beyond their current realities in order to achieve something greater. And honestly, deep trust happens when we actually invest in relationships. We create psychological safety. We make it safe to fail and to learn, because without that, you'll never have a growth mindset. So those two things, deep trust, high expectations, they work together to kind of create the conditions that we're talking about, where people can really achieve individually, but collectively. See, that's the key. It's never just about the individual. It has to be about, what do we achieve together? Are we a whole greater than the sum of the parts?
Yeah, I really like that. The deep trust and the high expectations. And I think that it's possibly the foundation is the meaningful work.
Mm-hmm.
So they're building off of that, but it seems like a connector for that, which you alluded to, was it has to be safe. There has to be collaboration, communication, avoiding assumptions. So, and this is where a lot of leaders fall down, is they make assumptions because they're not talking with people regularly and listening
Mm-hmm.
to people regularly. And
Mm-hmm.
so, or they have the high expectations, but they do not have firm boundaries that are
Mm-hmm.
empathetically kept in place. So it's like,
Yes.
they may get mad at somebody, but they let them get away with it when they violated some standard, and that kind of messes it up. But it seems like, if I'm hearing you correctly, the channel from that deep trust to high expectations is one where there's, and I don't mean micromanaging, but there's a lot of healthy collaboration. And when you say failure, it's very strategically designed so people don't fail in a huge way, but go
Yes.
pilot this piece, learn from it, and then
Yes.
go from there.
Yeah. And in fact, it's interesting, David. I do this work, constantly with teams and with whole organizations. And one of the ways that trust is eroded most rapidly is when there's no candor and no feedback in an organization. We've all know what it looks like, what it feels like. Like if I was doing this podcast and my piece of lettuce for my lunch was in my front tooth, and I went through the whole podcast and you didn't tell me, hey, Cheryl, you've got something, get that out of the way. Let's take a pause, clean up your act. Um, I would have left this experience with you with so little trust, right? You let me look like an idiot, and we fret and wonder, like, oh, somebody's doing something that's not working for them. Should I tell them? Well, if I'm their manager, if I'm their leader, if I don't tell them, that is the biggest erosion of trust in the organization. It's an erosion between the two of us, but
Yeah.
it's a huge erosion also for the others who are watching, right? Because
Yeah.
if my team saw the podcast and saw the lettuce in my tooth, guess what? They're going to be like, oh my gosh, how can I ever trust David? And how can I trust Cheryl? She watched herself on camera for an hour with something in her tooth and didn't do anything about it. So it's a silly example, but it's a real one, David, because one of the things that you find when you're working with teams and leaders all the time, as I'm sure you do, is, I mean, honestly, I just had an experience like this about a month and a half ago where, I had some really tough feedback for a senior leader, and they had hired me because they're trying to figure out, like, how do we help this person? They seem like they should be great, but they're not great. They're not great. And it's the soft stuff that's the problem for them. Well, I come in, we do the 360, we talk, I give them the direct feedback and they're like, why hasn't anybody ever told me? And when you look back over this person's career, they were promoted up rather than given the feedback and really given the context to really develop these skills.
Yeah.
And they are a set of skills. And unfortunately, by the time people get to a certain level, if they don't have that feedback, it gets harder and harder for the people around them to give them that feedback, right? You
Oh,
are
yeah.
inadvertently undermining people when you take credit for the work they've done. They're not here to make you look good. You're here to make them look good. That's a fundamental piece of leadership. This person just never learned that, right? So
Yeah.
the point that I'm making is that we just telling the truth is a sacred trust. Honestly, I feel that it's a sacred trust in organizations. We have to do it with kindness, empathy, compassion, candor. We have to be very sensitive to making sure that people are at a place of readiness to hear our candid feedback. But without candor and feedback, we cannot get to those places of deep trust. And then the high expectations are just limited by our capacity to get to the deep trust.
Well, you're talking to the right guy because I love your example because I tell people, you know who your friends are because if you have a poppy seed is typically or something caught in your teeth and you're talking and they don't tell you, then they're not a
Yeah,
close friend. And it's not whether they tell you, it's the tone of voice, whether they need to pull you aside in private and tell you. But the people who you really trust and the people who are close to you will always let you know and not let you get into that situation. I remember, boy, a
that's right.
long time ago, 40, 40 years ago, I met with a guy, pretty close to 40 years ago. I met with a guy, went through a whole meeting, 30 minutes, an hour. And at the end of the meeting, with a little bit of disgust in his voice, he said, by the way, the collar on your suit jacket is up. And, and I knew then I wasn't going to do any business with him. And he could have saved me a lot of
Yeah,
time if he'd done that in the beginning. So I think that
yeah.
that's great. You know, that's super important in a lot of leaders. They just assume somebody should know, or it's easy for them to complain about it. And by the way, I think it's a two-way street. Okay, so we
Absolutely.
talked about leaders knowing, but we actually do something with that I learned from a guy named Judd Boys, and I've adapted it, where we exchange expectations between leader and team member, direct reports, in writing.
Yes.
Here are
Great
the
idea.
behavioral expectations I expect of you. Can't be more than a page, and it's weighted for importance. Excuse me. And so there's no assumptions. All right. This is how I want you to behave to be the best boss I've ever had. Here's how I want you to behave to succeed in the role. And it's very effective. Doesn't have to be looked at that often if they're in sync. But as soon as they get out of sync and they get back to it, it really helps them get back on track. So,
I love that. I love that, David. It's very practical. A lot of people say, I don't have time for that. It's like, well, look at all the time you're spending in fixing the reality that
yeah,
you don't have those agreements and that
yeah,
explicitness and that level of candor and trust built in with you and your people. So love that. That's a great idea.
yeah, yeah. Well, not mine. It was Judd's. And Judd actually did it with his wife. And then he did it with his daughters as they raised their daughters. And he taught it to his clients. They looked at it each week. I've found that once you're in sync, you can look at it once a quarter, but you walk through each one by one. But well, as
Hmm.
we close this
Hmm.
out, Cheryl, this has been fascinating. Oh, I don't want to close out yet. I still have a question. Um, you talked about a lot how the generations are similar, and I saw that in some of the information you sent over. So it sounds like if the generations are similar, which I've actually thought for a while, I think the bad behaviors are more prominent these days because technology makes it easier to be bad, whether it's working two jobs at once or saying you're working, you're not, or whatever it might be. What are the key factors? We covered them already, but what's kind of a tipping point in the leaders that you've spoken with where you think you've got a team member or a team who's on board with the meaningful work that you're trying to achieve, the value you're trying to deliver to customers, the positive change in the world. Um, but it's not working out. And you're trying different things and they're not working out. How do you structure those boundaries? How do you structure that process? So you can reach a point where you can say, well, it's not going to work. We need to cut our losses and let this
Sure.
person or this team go, or you call in somebody else or whatever the process might be.
Sure. Well, I mean, it starts with what you and I just talked about is getting clear on expectations. And I think the very first question, if someone that I'm supervising, I'll put it in the first person, if someone um, I'm supervising is disappointing me in any respect, I need to first ask myself, are my expectations clear? Have I been clear in terms of what I'm looking for in this particular situation? And if not, I need to do the work to put the drawbridge down to get sort of the communication going, right? I should not leave it to chance. I should not leave it to see, I'll see if they figure it out. I should be very, very um, direct about those expectations. The other thing I should be is I should inquire. One of the phrases that we use a lot when we're helping organizations and it's late every day, they don't show up. It's kind of like my boss did. Why aren't you filling your time? Help me see what you see. A lot of times I think that it's very illuminating to ask the question, well, help me see what you see. What is happening from your point of view that makes it unclear what my expectations were, or even more likely, candidly, I mean, at least in my world, I rarely have a person that doesn't want to do a good job. They don't, I rarely have a person, David, that doesn't want to do a good job. What they think a good job looks like might be different than what I think.
Yeah,
So it's
yeah.
that digging into help me see what you see. Okay, let's build alignment. Let's understand. A lot of times for me, what I find that people don't do coming out of that is set regular check-in conversations so that we can see how we're doing. Another tactic that I have found to be very, very helpful, usually not in the first conversation, but if these same kinds of issues are continuing, again, I bet you do the same thing in your own work. I ask the person I've communicated with to tell me back in their own words, in one page, no more than one page, what they think, what they've heard as the set of issues that we're working on, what they understand the solution to be, and where they feel like they can get support or help to work on those issues. And I have found that to be very revelatory. It's another step in help me see what you see, right? Because
Yeah.
a lot of times you find that people, I mean, I hate to say it, but some people just learn differently than others. And some people are not auditory learners and they are paralyzed in a conversation around feedback. And you ask them to write it down and they'll come back, I actually need you to tell me again because I was so anxious or so hurt or so angry or so whatever that I didn't really get it. Um, Coming out of that, of course, if you still have serious performance shortcomings, I mean, that's why we have things like performance improvement plans. I mean, we certainly have structured processes like that in our company. I think
Yeah.
every company should have that because I never want somebody to get to the end of the road of their employment, certainly, but even the end of the road of their role on a team or whatever, without having many, many, many chances to show me that they know how to get their job done at a level of capability that is acceptable for the role that they're in. So that's where for me, I bring in the other experts in our team who are really good at helping people kind of go through that process, giving them support. And of course, sometimes it doesn't work, but at least by the time we get to that point, I want to always have a sense that we've done the very best I can with and for people, and we've given them the chance to do the very best that they can.
Yeah. It's interesting you say that because I have been in some situations where whether it was an individual or a team, I've gone into a meeting and I've said, okay, I want you guys to take the notes. And then after the meeting, you're going to send me your notes. And each individual on a team sends different notes. But the individual, it's okay. Well, you documented everything. And at times, maybe I'll just say, okay, well, let's go through your notes at the end of the meeting and see
Mhm.
how well they did. If it's a one-on-one and I want to discuss that. If it's a team where I'm having trouble with communication within the team, then it can be illuminating to have me send it in to me. But this has been great. Thank you so much. Any closing thoughts for our audience?
No, just thank you, David. I know you do a lot of this kind of work. Obviously, I've devoted my life to the people side of business and to building organizations where both the people and the business thrive. And I appreciate that you're doing the same work. I think it's really important. So thanks for having me on.
Oh, it's been an honor. Thank you so much, Cheryl.
Thank you.